do is we realized that what we realized is that the way we're doing it wasn't predictable. It wasn't really any of these things we set out to do. So we established some objectives. Um, it started with we needed to be more competitive, as many people in the room and online can relate. It's very hard to maintain proper employment. Recruitment and retention is difficult, and to do that, you absolutely have to be competitive in pay. Although not the most important thing, it's certainly at the near the top. And wanted something that was objective, something that you could look at and calculate and anticipate and plan for. Clear and consistent across all pay scales, across all. All right, my apologies. So help me out. Where did we leave off? I got disconnected there for a second.
Not sure. This is not the slide you were on when you went away. You were one previous.
Oh, I was on that one.
You were talking about you had come up with a different way to try to be more. You were trying to keep your pay at the top of the levels to be good for recruitment and retention. Does that help?
Yep. Okay. So we wanted to be competitive, and that was our objective number one for recruitment and retention. We wanted to be objective, something that wasn't biased, something that went could be defended across all employees. We wanted something clear and consistent for all of the employees and all of the positions to be able to look forward and see what they had to do, what they could do, and what they could anticipate in the future for pay. Again, we wanted to be fair, both to the district, the taxpayers, and the employees. Realistic. Can we do it? Can we afford it? Does it work? Affordability. Obviously, we are as is everybody conscious with our budget. Tim, the directive from him was we had to have a way to anticipate, control, and have some sort of a cap on salaries. And we wanted it to be individualistic. We wanted it to pertain specifically somehow to each of the employees and kind of celebrate their uniqueness. All right, so I'm not saying this is how you do it. I'm not even saying all of this is how we used to do it, but it's kind of a shot in the dark. And while we have a metric for how we anticipate or how we offer pay ranges, it didn't have a lot of controlled variables, and sometimes it was just a shot in the dark because we had to try to anticipate. We valued at the moment for what we needed for staff, for providers. The problem is, as many of you know, is that it doesn't work. And I'll show you the next example specifically why it doesn't work. Sorry, my screen's playing, my internet is unstable, which is odd. I'm testing it on my.
Why don't you shut your video off so it's not taking up some bandwidth?
There we go. How's that?
Keep going.
Okay, so the problem we run into is that the market rate is only dry employees, and it causes costly corrections, and you end up having to do lump sum adjustments, and that's just not sustainable. So here's an example that principle. So if you hire somebody in 2015 and you hire them for $50,000 a year, and that's fine, and you're fortunate enough to really 3% living every year. In 2020, they'll be making $59,703.
Hey, Dave.
The problem with that is that
Dave, We're just not getting
Yep.
your audio. Log off and log back in again.
Okay.
So my brief example on this, if you don't have a way to anticipate the growth of the market value of your labor force, in this example, you can see that if we hire somebody, the same year 2020, where the market growth is growing 4% a year on top of the 3% cost of living, then you end up hiring somebody that's brand new for $70,000 a year, when your 5-year paramedic that's been with you for that long is only making about $60,000 a year. So the steps that we used to determine this is we set out, found some salary ranges for each position. We'll talk specifically about each one of these. You have to calculate your range, not only the top and the bottom, but the middle. Number of steps for each pay step or pay scale. The critical objectives, benchmarks that you want to, and the deviations between the steps. So salary surveys are establishing the range. There's a lot of salary surveys. Some tools we'll go over here real quick. Government data, comparative budgets, comparative positions in our fields, which I think is particularly important. And then job boards, postings, listservs, things like that. For salary surveys, I found a lot of success with Indeed, Monster, Glassdoor. These are free tools. They're kind of right up front on their dashboard. GEMS occasionally will, every couple will do a salary survey across the country. And that's also helpful. So here's an example of Indeed. So I just basically put in the basic parameters of paramedic and in Colorado Springs, and it tells you what they make an hour. You can do that by the hour or by the year. What I like about Indeed is that they'll also tell you exactly who's paying what, at least based on their most recent feedback. So in your general relative traffic area, you kind of see who the competition is and what they're paying. Over to Monster, I think probably the most useful. However, I don't know that it's the most accurate. But it's definitely a tool. And then you have Glassdoor, which, for those of you that don't know about Glassdoor, one of the things that's unique about Glassdoor is that it offers a feedback section. So employees that are currently or have worked with an organization can leave their feedback. So you can actually go look up your own agency and see kind of what people are saying, what your employees or past employees think of you, in a kind of anonymous, objective manner. So good feedback there. This is an example of the GEMS. Obviously, this is dated. I haven't done one in a while, at least not one I could find, but this is kind of how they do that. For government data, I would have said prior to this last year that the government data that I've used in the past has always been very dated. The Department of Local Affairs is where you can find budgets for districts that are in your area. But the Bureau of Labor Statistics, they can have a new platform in the last probably 10, 12 months. And I found it to be very, very useful and I think fairly accurate. So they kind of give you the gross information, not only of like how many people are in that field, but what the percentiles are for pay. And then they give you the map of where you sit by region or state or density area. Again, we talked about Department of Local Affairs. All right. I use Colorado Springs Fire's budget. It is a fire medic and they are the big ones, but that kind of gave me the top range. So you can look their budget up online. Here's where I think I got the most useful information. In addition to paramedics and what they make across the country, I set out for, and this was more true for EMTs, to be perfectly honest. I thought about it for a while. I'm like, if you're 18 years old and you're willing to go through a 4 to 6 month training program for EMT or firefighter 1 or to get your post certification, what would you come out of that as a brand new person in one of those positions? And what's the pay scale? Because they are comparable. So I spent quite a bit of time looking into these. And again, you can just use the salary finders on Indeed or Monster or Bureau of Labor Statistics to see kind of how these other entry level positions pay and make sure you're on the right track. Job boards postings, hopefully, most people are on these. If you're not, there's great resources. They send out job postings and, advertisements or whatnot. Facebook is another good place. If you're belong to some of the EMS groups around the state, you can get postings for that, follow different organizations. And this is going to give you kind of real-time salary range parameters to kind of cross-check what you've done, make sure that you're competitive. And it has to be relative as well. Obviously, we can't all pay. Colorado Springs Fire pays their fire medics. We can't do that. We can't, that based on your assessed value and kind of where your finances come from and what it looks like, we can't all pay our beginning medics $90-some thousand a year. That's just not realistic. But if you look at kind of the job postings, it does give you an idea across the state and region who's paying what. The next step that has to happen is you have to calculate the low and the high, and that's fairly easy. You can look at, again, the different postings or the different salary surveys that you've done. But you have to start somewhere, and that's important. And I'll show you why in the next slide, to determine really where you are, because what your range is or what your steps should be or how far from the midpoint, and that's really the critical piece of information that you need, is decide, competitively and also budgetarily where your midpoint is. What I found was that there's actually a standard for this. So this is a tool that Indeed offers, and it's fairly helpful. But if you're not already, and I'm not advertising, I don't get any kickbacks for them, but the Society of Human Resource Managers is kind of the go-to for human resources. And so they have this article tool that kind of explains that once you know the midpoint, how you can calculate what your range should be based on a known variable, where you want to start, where the midpoint is. Maybe it's the max you're able to pay for that position, and then you can start to look at what should the range be and compare that to your salary survey and the competition. So this is a very simple example. This is their 30% rule. So salary range for position is about $40,000. So what's the low point? What's the
There's a lot of bad weather between us and that. Yes.
Dave, if you can hear us,
Can you hear me?
there you go. You're back. Go ahead.
Sorry, glitched. All right, so this is the SHRM tool. This is the example, kind of gives you the high and the low once your midpoint is known. So then here's where it gets a lot more individual to your agency. And some of this is controversial. Questions I want to argue because it depends on what you value.
There it is.
Okay. So what we decided to use for how many steps we should have is the value over time or the productive years of a particular rank. So EMT, paramedic, lieutenant, captain. And once we started talking about it, we realized that, if you get comfortable and you stay in one position for a very long time, let's say you're an EMT and, all you want to ever do is just kind of stay being an EMT. Well, that's fine. And that's a good individual choice if that works for you. However, what we found is that productivity for about 3 years. They've learned their position well. They've gotten very good at what there is to do, but then there's nowhere to go from there. So they start to stagnate, and that kind of affects morale, attitude, productivity, things like that. It's different for every position. Now, this is desire to promotion. Example, if you're EMT for 3 years and you become paramedic, that starts it back at 0. So time in rank. So here's kind of what we came up with as far as, long-term productivity goes. Again, the EMT, we have a rule that, after your 3rd year of EMT, to promoting your, then we need to talk about your career there. So this is a tool to use to help you determine how many steps or how many levels you want to your pay scale, based on what you expect and what you've seen or what your agency values. And that's going to be a very important point that's individual to your agency. So the next thing we set out to do is to determine some critical objective benchmarks. So not only years in position, but what we want to see you accomplish, or what do we want you to have as kind of that added value to that position as you promote or you progress up the steps. And this has several objectives to it. Objective number 1 is we want to avoid stagnation, because we found that that's really kind of detrimental to our culture. The other thing we want to do is, we pride ourselves on career advancement, professional development, personal development, and introducing that value-added principle to employment to make that very clear and understandable. So we decided, there are things like level of training, educational achievements, what are different challenges you've accepted, and what we feel what are important and what we want to add to this metrics. So I'll give you specific examples here in a second. And then the last thing is you have to determine units of deviation. So this is also very personal, and it has to do with your budget, has to do with how you want to manage this program. It can be by percentage, it can be by dollar amount, it can be in other complementing programs. Again, but this is definitely one of the trickiest parts of this whole thing. And once I show you kind of what we came up with, a lot of this will be more clear. So this is our pay scale metrics for the rank of paramedic. Now, let me kind of just walk you through this. The rank step, you got to put a number in there somehow. So it's 1 through 9. And then minimum years of experience, they're not, they don't go up individually. 7's missing, and 3, 4, and 5 are listed twice. Absolute requirements. So what has to be true, what has to happen is that minimum years experience required, and this is with our agency, not how long you've been a paramedic. This is in our agency. And absolute requirements, both of those have to be true before you can move up a step. So, for example, if you've been there for 3 years, but you haven't done our MAP training, then you can't produce to step 3. You can't promote to step 3. You're stuck at step 2. And if you stay there for the next 10 years because you don't want to take that training, then you don't advance a step and your pay remains the same. If you choose to take that training, and again, we've put these in there because this is what is of value to us. This is what somebody that's been there longer can add to their value that values our organization. So that was the method of the madness behind the absolute requirements. So both the minimum years have to be true and the absolute requirements have to be true. And for every rank, these are a little bit different. Here's EMT. It only goes to step 3. You can't promote to step 4. It doesn't exist. And if you don't go through the MAP training, your 2nd year, you can't move up a step in pay. If you don't want to be a field instructor for EMTs after your 3rd year, which is your most productive year in our opinion, then you don't promote to that step. So revisiting the objectives that we set out when we wanted to do this, I think we're fairly comfortable in that the first 6, I think we did fairly well. And we didn't, the individualistic one, or how do we honor the contributions that that individual has unique to them that might make them more valuable? So we don't just kind of put everybody in the same bucket. So we wanted to look at things like their education and their training. What achievements have they had there? Recognize strengths outside of the step schedule. So like their years of experience, does that have value to us? And we believe it does. How do we reward people for the certifications that they get, instructor certifications, provider certifications, and then levels of responsibility. We have, as many people do, all of our employees have extra duties, projects they take on. It might be ordering medical supplies, it might be fleet maintenance, it might be taking care of the physical plant, the facilities. And how do we didn't want to compensate somebody that once a year has to look at the certs and say, okay, everything looks good. And it's obviously more complicated than that, but not a lot, versus the person that every single day has to keep track of the medical supplies or put them away, hit par levels, make sure they're not over budget. That's a monster. And we don't want to say, well, everybody has an extra duty, so everybody gets, that's part of your pay, because then it's not fair. It's not equal. You're doing a little bit of work, someone else is doing a lot of work, and you're both getting the same. So we needed a tool. The disclosure on this, before I kind of walk through it, I will tell you, credit where credit is due. The inspiration for this came from Gunnison Valley. They do a little bit different, but the general concept of what this came from, it came from them. So here we have a couple different categories. So your time and rank. So this is how many years you've been a paramedic, how many years you've been an EMT before you got to our agency. And you're allowed to include the years at our agency in this number as this is reevaluated periodically. What kind of education do you have? Do you have military experience? Do you have instructor certifications? And then what other certifications do you have? The areas that are blocked out, and you see the columns as they go down, are rank specific, because different things have value based on what your job responsibility is. You'll see that if you're an EMT, we decided that being an EMT with a master's degree did not make you a more valuable EMT than being just an EMT. So in that category, there is no points given for a master's degree in the EMT column, but you go to captains, you do value that. And then on the far right, you'll see these are our extra duties and how much, relatively compared to each other, how much those extra duties are worth. So the way this works, I made up a fictional, and these are points, by the way. We tried very hard to make this a percentage, to just add percentage, and that works just fine until you want to do cost of living increases, or you want to increase everything by a percentage, and then it quickly gets disproportional and unaffordable. So we stopped counting at 1,000 points, and basically how it works, if you'll notice, between the amount of money that is different between every step is constant. So if you look at the bottom, the increment is $3,200 between steps, which means that, and again, depending on the rank, that varies. So we'll go back to here. We stop counting at 1,000 points, and basically every 100 points is worth that. So in this case, with $3,200 in the increment between steps, 10% that's $300. So every 100 points you are on the sheet, every 100 points you score on the sheet gets you $300 added to whatever step you're on, and you can't go more than one step up. So this particular person, if you add up all of the highlighted columns and all highlighted rows in the paramedic column, has earned 560 points. We go in whole units of 100, so that's 500 points, which means that 5 times 320 is $1,600. Their base rate, 62,500. They get an extra $16 for their cumulative considerations for the value they bring to the table, and then their final pay is $64,100.
Dave, do you take COLA into consideration at all?
We do, and so it's an excellent question. It's actually a great segue. Thank you. Here's how that works. So we'll just look again at paramedic. What we can do now is not only just for COLA, but we can also do it for market value, because that's a variable of COLA. You know, the value of a paramedic in our industry, as you all know, does not go up strictly by the CPI or whatever metrics you choose to use for cost of living. You know, it's supply and demand, so that vacillates as well. So what we're able to do, and there's a couple of ways you can do this, but you can simply just raise the monetary values in that right-hand column by whatever your cost of living is. The other way that you can do it, and that's the way that we're going to do it this time, and we're going to see how it works out. The other way to do it is to reestablish your pay scale based on cost of living and then recalculating it using those formulas that I showed in the previous slide. That is going to be a little bit disparative based on, if you start with your midpoint and you only use that for COLA, then your beginning and ending, your low and high ranges are maybe a little bit less or a little bit more than you know, if you give 3%, they may go anywhere from 2.75 all the way up to, you know, 3.2, because it's not equitable. The math just doesn't work that way. At least didn't work that way for me. So we're going to just take each of these numbers and increase them by whatever we decide to do for cost of living. Now, if we come back and say, well, gosh, there's been a huge market shift, there's now a glut of paramedics, we won't ever go down. Well, I shouldn't say that. I don't think we'll ever go down. I hope we don't ever go down. But if all of a sudden the state and federal programs that are trying to get paramedics into school are trying to get, you know, allied health bolstered as far as the employment numbers, then maybe the value isn't that high, and we start to see the range either narrow, or we start to see the whole range drop. You can adjust that way as well. And obviously, if it goes up, which I think we all should anticipate it doing, we can adjust that in the whole separate space you would do to determine how accurate, competitive, and meet all the objectives that we set forth to do with the pay rate itself. So does that answer your question, Eric?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Okay. So we've made it individual. We've allowed for a little bit of extra compensation, and it's not a lot, but you know what? It turns out what we have found, as I ask people as we're going through this process how they feel about it, and by far and large, the majority of the input that I have gotten is that it doesn't necessarily matter. It can't be silly, but the recognition is the most important part. The fact that you value what I bring to the table, it doesn't necessarily have to have a giant monetary value attached to it. It's you're acknowledging that I have these benefits, that I add value to my position for what I've done and accomplished in my career, and you're recognizing that, and I really appreciate it. That's the feedback that we've gotten. So, you know, I think we did pretty well there. So here's what we don't know, and if this can be a conversation, or if you have input, I'd love to hear it. How often can an employee recalculate? So can they come back to you and say, hey, I got my CPR instructor certification, I want to recalculate my my point sheet to see if I can increase my pay. Can we do that every time they get a new certification? Do we do that every 6 months? Do we do that every year? Right now, we've kind of decided to do it every year. We talked about doing it at the 6 month mark. We kind of missed that time frame. And on exceptions, when somebody comes and says, hey, I have this new responsibility, or I have this new degree or whatever, something that adds significant value, then we can recalculate. But right now we're doing it on an annual basis. And again, we talked about the cost of living increases. Should that be applied to the entire column of compensation, or should we apply that to the range and recalculate using that acceptable formula of the 30% or 30 or 40% rule, which is also, by the way, you have an opportunity, if you want there, to throw in your market value. If you say, hey, we're really struggling to get paramedics, so we're going to go 10% above that market value or 15% above that market value, then you can increase your market value by cost of living, then put that increase in there as well. The key to this, and what makes it in up front seem like it's a little bit more expensive, is to make a market correction for what your pay range is. It automatically brings everybody up to that competitive level, so that you're not ending up, as we demonstrated earlier, that if you just let somebody sit there with cost of living increases every year, and that's not keeping up with market value, you can have a disparity of $10,000, $20,000, $25,000 between the person you're hiring that's brand new and the person that's been there for 5 years and may have significantly more experience before they came to you. And then if you want to make that fair and equitable, you have to increase their pay, and that can be a big number. And if you have 2, 3, 4 of those on your roster, that where the disparity has gotten that big, that's a giant chunk of change. So while it seems like that's a little bit more expensive up front, in the end, it comes out the more efficient model. How often should we do a market survey? Should we do it every year, every 2 years? Right now, we're looking at every 2 years. I know there's a lot of tools that I've mentioned, but it's still a lot of work, and it's still a fair amount of math and some judgment, and a lot of conversation is saying, where are we? What do we value? What can we afford? So how often do you do that? The benchmarks, what levels of training or what contributions in the primary step schedule, are those really what we value? Are they achievable? Do we have people that aren't promoting because what we're asking them to do is not worth that money to them, or is not worth moving up a step? And will our values change in the future? A lot of the things we talked about, whether it's the productive lifespan of somebody in each rank, whether it's how much do we value, associate's degree, how much do we value military experience, how much do we value experience, in field and rank that you have before you come to those. Those are all things, those are value statements about your agency that your agency has to determine. So, I'm conscious that those may change, and I want to keep everybody that put their input into this system kind of on the wheel of that, to make sure that we don't lose track. And then last, long term, is this budgetarily realistic? If you move the whole salary range, up by market and by cost of living every year, that increases your payroll line item by significantly. I think that, personally, what I struggle with, and I've been in this field for quite a while, and I know what I started off as when I was a paramedic and how much I made per year and per hour. And, the thought that we can have paramedics that are making 6 figures now, my mind just doesn't comprehend that. And I want to get out of my bubble, because when you looked at that Bureau of Labor Statistics and you looked at that map, the range went to $107,000 for the rank of paramedic. That's not lieutenant, that's not captain, that's not deputy chief, that's paramedic. So the other part of this is we just have to kind of maintain that mental flexibility to realize that, it is more expensive. And if you we've all had these conversations and say, wow, paramedics are making $100,000 a year. When I started 20 years ago, I only made 30. Well, when I started 20 years ago, a gallon of milk cost $1.06. So, you know, you look at how many times that's increased, and this is not the point of this conversation, but just that point of, I have really had to work to kind of expand my mindset of what's reasonable and what's not reasonable. Other questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, you know, you said that you borrowed part of that from Gunnison, and I'm curious how your tool looks compared to that one, CJ, just in the sense of what I saw from your tool is that you value monetarily, you are valuing retention at a much higher rate at the cost of potentially recruitment of experienced providers. And I think that's good if you have low turnover, and I think you can pay out over time, but are you guys doing it the same way where you can only go one step for experience and outside?
So the primary difference between how we decided to do it and how it is, what my understanding of how Gunnison Valley does it is that for each of the value variables that we talked about, that this sheet right here, for each of those, instead of a point system that increases the pay by a percentage, they start with, everybody starts the year or start whatever evaluation period there is at the base rate. So if we say, if you're a brand new paramedic out of school, then our rate for that is $60,000. And if you have X amount of experience, you go up by a fraction of a percent for every year. If you have a degree, that's this much, another percentage. Military, all these values that we have in ours, and theirs are a little bit different. And I believe the list is a little bit shorter. But as you go through, you add up all of these percentages or fractions of a percentage, and then you get to a number. Say, for someone that has significant experience, that number might be 60%. So you would multiply that base rate that a brand new paramedic would get times 60%, or 1.6, and then that is the pay scale, and that happens every year. The probability, I could not make the math work. I can make the math work for this year. Where I really struggled to make the math work is when you start adding cost of living or market adjustments every year, because that skews the percentage. And where you say, I'm going to increase our base unit by 3% for cost of living, and then you filter that through all of those percentages, the person that has significant experience and has several, that 60% added value to that base rate ends up getting about an 11% raise. And while I'm always happy to, help everybody get his so the most likely reason for that is that CJ is just much smarter than I am. Or there's a variable that I'm missing, and the next time he and I have the ability to have that conversation, I definitely now have a wider foundation to ask some more intelligent questions. But that's how they do it, and that's why we did it this way. This tends to be a more consistent, budget stable approach to it, to where we can then play with those cost of living and market adjustments and have it be equitable across all the ranks and across all of the steps within each rank. So does that answer your question?
I think so. I'd be happy to show you our tool. Dave's is very similar. I'd like to get a hold of his. It's, at the end of the day, they're achieving, I think, the similar approach, which one of Dave's main point is valuing the achievements of the individual and somehow equitably building that into the scale with their years of service. And my results are the same as Dave's, but staff generally like it because they can see it's an equitable approach to compensation.
Okay, we've got a question online. Sherilyn, go ahead.
Yeah, good afternoon, and thank you. Sherilyn Whitler here with Southeast Florida Hospital Ambulance Service, way down in the southeast corner of the state. And I'm just interested in your insight, and anyone in the group actually, regarding how to set rank value for like intermediate. I have an intermediate who's been an intermediate for 5 years now and would like to go up to paramedic. But my problem is that I'm having trouble getting our administrative and HR staff to understand the values. And so the reality is right now that if she becomes a paramedic, she's probably going to have to take a pay cut, which is ridiculous. So I'm just interested, is there anyone else that's had to deal with that intermediate to paramedic and that rank value, how I can give, honor for years of service that's been ALS, but not at the paramedic level. And then I actually have a couple more things that go along with that, but I'll see if there's any input on that first part.
Well, Sherilyn, I'm sorry, I think I'm talking to my person on the little boxes on my screen. There is an Achilles heel to this, and that was going to kind of be my closing statements, but we'll address it now. The Achilles heel for that is that there has to be some room for flexibility. For example, if you, based on our schedule, so let's say you're a fairly, productive, you have a lot of these certifications, you have years, years in, and let's say you've been a paramedic for, I think it was 5 or 6 years, and you're now making, $85,000 according to this scale. If you then wanted to promote to paramedic lieutenant, and you start at 0 when you change ranks, then that's a significant pay cut.
Mm-hmm.
So what that does is that obviously you can't do that. So what the approach that we've decided to take is that just is a negotiation. You sit down with that individual and you talk about the what the pay scale says and where they are, and you negotiate. And what is helpful is that once you negotiate that that pay rate that they're going to walk into lieutenant as, maybe let's just because I have it on the screen, let's relate that to EMT to paramedic. You've been an EMT for a lot of years, and you have a lot of experience, and you're at $65,000 as an EMT, and you want to be a paramedic, but that means you have to drop down to $62,500. I might agree to say, hey, I tell you what, when you promote to paramedic, let's start you out at that 65,700, so you don't have to take a pay rate. And that's fine, but part of the negotiation is that's where then they land at that step 2. So really you're saying, I'm going to promote you to step 2 right away. And then all of the rules still apply. So you can't go up a step as a paramedic for a couple more years, or until you meet the critical criteria, the absolute requirements of that step. And maybe it's a step or 2 higher than that. Something that makes it profitable and equitable for them to promote to paramedic, but at the same time allows you to, have that objectivity and to put them back on a schedule that is equal to everybody else, where they can advance to from there. And they may have to wait a year or 2 to promote to get, up a step, but that also seems to go over fairly well.
Okay, thank you. And then my second question has to do with the market survey. I'm part of a hospital district, typically what they've used for a market survey in the past has been only other hospitals. I'm struggling to reach out past that. And so obviously, since there aren't a ton of hospitals, especially critical access hospitals that employ a lot of EMS providers, we're looking at fairly small numbers. And so I apologize if I missed a little bit of this early on. I had to miss a few minutes at the beginning of the lecture, but any recommendations on the best place to have to kind of start looking at those market surveys?
I think what's important about that is to look. There's 2 different ways we chose to look at that. Way number 1 is you should absolutely look at where your direct competition is. So if you're finding that people are leaving your hospital to go to other hospitals because other hospitals are paying them more, then I think that is the absolutely bottom line, most valuable information you can have. However, I also, as I kind of expressed, think that you have to kind of look outside the box, because we're not just losing our employees to comparable other agencies that are comparable by rank and responsibility, and they have a higher pay rate. We're losing people to other career fields that are still within our first responder kind of industry But it's, nursing is, or even firefighting, they're both classic examples. If you're a paramedic or an EMT and you're making X, and with about the same amount of training, you can go over to be a nurse or a firefighter and you can make X times 2, then that's where you're going to go. And not everybody does that, but enough people do it that I think it's important to expand that salary survey outside of just your specific industry or even your niche within that industry, because that's not reality. That's not who we're competing against. The field is much wider than that.
Okay. Thank you. I appreciate that feedback.
Any other comments for Sherilyn? Thank you, Sherilyn. I thought you had said you had a third question.
Well, I just was interested if there's any information people have on the kind of trying to push that paramedic to RN salary difference a little bit. I noticed I was looking on a couple of the websites, Indeed, and I think I checked Glassdoor and a couple others, but across the board, about a $15 per hour difference between paramedic and RN. And if anybody is trying to kind of close that window, and what's that looking like for you?
I will concede to the audience, because to be perfectly honest with you, if there's an answer for that, I would like to hear it just as much as you.
It's kind of crickets here in the room, Sherilyn.
Was it discussing the?
She's looking at how to close the gap between paramedic and RN when they're both working in the same.
In her service?
Well, no, I think that's in the hospital setting, correct, Sherilyn?
Just kind of in general, I feel like, as I'm sure probably many of you do, that the training length of time training and even scope of what can be done is relatively similar. And yet the pay difference is significant. And so has anybody kind of worked to try to close that gap at all? And how is that going?
Well, I would take issue with training being similar. I mean,
You're gonna have to speak up a little.
I'm sorry. I would take issue with the training being similar. I mean, you really can't find a nurse these days working in a hospital who doesn't have a bachelor's degree. But then you look at the economics of it, it's all about what is the sort of revenue recovered from that individual employee. And I think that nurses in the hospital have a much better ability to generate revenue.
John, I think the other thing I could point to is in some ways we have managed to conquer that. And anybody that knows me knows, my promotion of, community paramedicine as an answer to a lot of the calls for assistance that we get in the EMS field is definitely a growing and expanding field. And with that comes a significant amount of additional training and responsibility. And I take no credit for this. This is all James McLaughlin, who I know is with you today. But we did as part of our salary survey, we said, really the amount of training that our paramedics had to go through to become not only community paramedics, but community paramedics that were qualified to do what we do for the community in our specific program. And I know there's a lot of other Eagle County, you guys are on the cutting edge. There's a lot of other really great programs. But here's the cool thing. In doing our salary survey and looking at other fields, we says, really they're approaching this level of mid-level providers, master's level providers. And how do we do that? And so we looked up like master's level therapists, licensed clinical social workers, master's mental health providers, and our community paramedics make significantly more than they do. And I've heard, from I've seen from the nursing surveys too, you're right, it is a significant gap. But if you look specifically at our community paramedics and their pay scale, that we've closed that gap significantly. And again, Tiny has closed that gap significantly.
Thank you, Dave. Any other questions for Dave? Comments?
I've got one, Ken. I
Yes.
think it's a larger thing to talk about the industry, but when we look at those gaps between paramedics and nursing, we're step one, it's the education level. There's too much race to the bottom in EMS for faster education to put butts in seats. Gotta stop doing it. We do it to ourselves.
Look at how the nurses have.
Yes. you know,
Once again,
we're our own worst enemy. I tell my chief all the time, when I feel like our service overextends our goodwill, it's the Mother Teresa quote. We've done so much with so little for so long, we're not qualified to do everything with nothing. People don't see our value as a paramedic. And part of increasing our value is like, hey, we're comparable to nursing because we followed in their footsteps. They've lobbied themselves well, they've educated themselves well, and they've created that value. And I think we fail to market ourselves as a whole in an industry as the value of what a paramedic brings. Because how many news articles do we still see, oh, it cost this much money and all they did was drive you to the hospital?
well, and we shoot ourselves in the other foot, because I hear in all these meetings all the time, well, you know, nursing is a higher level of care. And that's a bullshit argument that shoots us in the foot. It's not a higher level of care, it's a completely different level of care.
It's the Venn diagram, and there's a lot to learn from their profession. And so we do a very specific function, but we also can plug into other different functions, right? It's awesome to see paramedics moving into the ER scape, the hospital scape, because man, I can hire that paramedic and they can do all these things, but they're cheaper. We've got to fix that. And part of that is entry into this profession can't get lower. And we have to make it harder, for lack of a better term, to be a paramedic. We have to enforce those standards. And I think Dave nails it with his pay scales. Like, when you pay someone more for their education or more for a specific duty they do besides driving a patient in an ambulance, right, to be kind of lowball in that, that's driving your value, right, to not only your people that work for you, but your community. Over and over again, we have to message that to the community that there is more than you call, we haul, that's all. We're doing an assessment, you know, UPRAD's diverting people from the hospital, which besides the financials means that when you as a voter in that community, you get in the ER faster because it's not full of a bunch of drunks, or we've sent people that have behavioral and mental health issues to the right place the first time, and they're not just sitting in the ER like they often do in many places for days. And so the financials, dollar signs are important, but I think value has very strong qualitative things that we have to keep looking at. Voters are emotional, and we've got to play to those, change all of these things. I think it's totally systematic.
And if I can build on that, Nick, I think what you're talking about is, yeah, absolutely. I mean, what you're talking about there is using education as a force multiplier. That's where the value comes in, because when you educate your workforce, they become your force multiplier. You don't have to, because the pushback we hear all the time, and I'll be honest, it's coming from fire, it's coming from private ambulance. Not all, but some, where they're saying, I just need a butt in the seat. Okay, that's fine, but if you don't educate that butt in the seat, you're gonna need more butts in the seat. Because you're gonna try and continue doing the same thing over and over again and expect a different result. And the reality is we can't continue to transport everybody, the most expensive form of transport to the most expensive destination. You need highly educated people that are gonna change that paradigm, and that's exactly what you're talking about. That's where your force multiplier concept comes from. So thank you so much for saying that.
All right.
I have one question, just real quick, if I may. Obviously, when someone's speaking on that end, I see it's Kim. For some reason, the feed from the owl or whatever it is you're using, I've lost. If you don't mind, who was speaking before James was? Oh, there you are.
It was Zoobs.
Come on, Dave, you don't remember my voice?
There.
Nick Zuber.
I thought that's what I thought, but I didn't see him when I was looking earlier on the screen, and I'm glad you're there. Good to hear from you, Nick.
You too, Dave. This is good stuff.
All right, very good conversation, good reaction to everybody. We're going to take lunch now.